Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. My name is Hack, and in this video, we'll be breaking down how to build the best character for you and your playstyle in the Elder Scrolls Online. Whether you're brand new to ESO or you're an experienced veteran looking to start something new, we've covered every single detail you need to make the best possible build for you. So sit back, get comfortable. Timestamps are provided if you need to skip around or rewatch a section, and let's get started creating the best ESO builds possible. Now in this video, I'm going to basically go through my steps in build creation. Step number one is always starting with a goal. Basically, what's the goal for your character? In other words, what do you want the character to be able to do? Now class is certainly important and it helps set the flavor for how the build looks and plays, but the way ESO is set up, every class can essentially do the same thing, just in different ways. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to assume that you already know what class you want to play. I'll have a link down in the description if you need more help choosing the right class. So as far as your build goal, you want to start asking questions like, do you want to focus on solo content or group content? If it's group content that you want, then you also want to make a goal to focus on a specific area like dealing damage, tanking, or healing. But if you're soloing, you'll need to plan on how your build can sort of do all three of those things at once. Along with this, you'll also want to consider whether you want to focus on PvE content, PvP content, or a little bit of both. Now when you're first starting out in ESO, there's not a huge difference between PvE and PvP builds, especially under level 50. Can you do damage? Great, you'll be able to do PvE and PvP with that build. Can you heal or tank? That's great, you can probably do the same thing in either PvE or PvP content. However, once you hit level 50 and beyond, then there starts to be significant differences in ideal builds for PvE versus PvP. Basically, the higher level you are in this game, the more specific your build starts to be in order for it to be truly successful. So if you're approaching level 50 or already past it, go ahead and decide whether you want this build to focus specifically on PvE or PvP. And don't worry, you can always pick up multiple gear sets to support both playstyles if you want to. For step two, we're going to think about the race for our build. Basically, once you have your class picked and you know the goal or the direction you want this build to take, you're going to sit down and look at the different race options for ESO that are going to fit your build the best. Now, let me be clear, many players start ESO and they just pick their favorite race based on what they look like or because they like the lore of a particular Elder Scrolls race, and that's totally fine. In the end, race accounts for probably around a 5% difference in efficiency between the ideal race for your build and a not so ideal race. The point here is you shouldn't worry about your ESO race unless you plan to be extremely competitive at the top end of the top 5% players who like to min-max every single detail. That being said, I will give my recommendations here if you're starting brand new to the game, because I think it will be helpful. Now, if you're not quite sure yet where you want to start, then a few of the best all-around racial picks are going to be Dark Elf and Khajiit. Both races have what I call hybrid stats, meaning they have both stamina and magicka, as well as some form of damage, whether it's weapon and spell damage or critical chance. And these stats can basically apply to any build or any content in the game. As you can see here, Dark Elves have a bit more power when it comes to your primary resources. They have more stamina and magicka, as well as a solid weapon and spell damage bonus, while Khajiits are more focused on critical damage and recovery. As I said, these races will be great choices for literally any build in the game if you don't know where to start. These races are also great for DPS builds because of their damage-focused stats. And speaking of DPS, some other great choices for damage-dealing builds include High Elf and Orc. As you can see, both races have the same weapon and spell damage bonus that Dark Elf has, which is going to give you a great head start in the damage department. And High Elf tends to be a little bit better for magicka-focused builds, as you can see, due to that max magicka bonus, while Orc tends to be a bit better for stamina-focused builds due to their stamina and health. If you plan on being a tank, both Nord and Imperial are amazing options, though Imperial does come behind a paywall, so I tend to prefer Nord. Nords are the only race in ESO with an actual buff to their armor. And if you plan on being a bit more healer-focused, then both Argonian and Breton are great choices. Argonians have built-in healing plus great stats, while Bretons are the kings and queens of magicka sustain, letting you cast those magicka-based heals non-stop pretty much, without worrying as much about running out of magicka. Now that you have your basic characters set up with class and race in ESO, you need to start setting up your basic stats. This includes your attributes as well as food or drink and potions. And all these aspects are extremely important and can add a lot of power to your build. First, let's talk attributes because it's a lot simpler than a lot of people think. For most builds, including solo builds, DPS builds, and healers, both in PvE and PvP content, you'll want to invest all of your attribute points into either stamina or magicka. Why? Well, these two options are what actually will scale or improve the vast majority of your skills. For example, damaging skills will do more damage the higher your magicka or stamina pool is. Healing skills will also heal for more health when you increase that stamina or magicka pool. Now, the scaling mechanic of ESO is actually hybridized, where it doesn't matter which pool is higher. It could be stamina or magicka. The game just looks at both, and it takes the highest value, along with your weapon or spell damage, to calculate the power of that skill. So if that's true, then how do you decide between the two of them, either stamina or magicka, to focus your attribute points? Well, it really all depends on the abilities that you are wanting to use the most. And this is where we start to differentiate, calling our build a stamina build or a magicka build. If most of your abilities cost stamina to cast, you'll want to stack all 64 attribute points into stamina, because this gives you the maximum amount of stamina to cast those abilities before you run out of that resource. In other words, this is what we would call a stamina build or a stamina-focused build. The same is true, obviously, for magicka builds. In this case, you're running more magicka costing skills, and so you'll want as much magicka as possible, putting all 64 points into your magicka pool, ensuring that you can cast as many of those magicka skills as much as you want before running out of gas. Now, what about health? Well, health in ESO, for the most part, is really more of a defensive resource than an offensive one. Yes, there are a few damage skills, particularly on the Warden class, that improve with higher health, but there's just a few of those. So with the health attributes, you'll want to pump this higher on builds where your main focus is survival rather than damage. The obvious choice for this is if your goal is to play a tank in group content. Putting all 64 points into health is an option here, or you could also split your resources a bit more, spreading them out between all three stats so that you have strong survival but also a bit of stamina and magicka to use abilities. From attributes, that leads us directly to our next discussion, which is food and drink, which is really just an extension of your overall stats. Basically, there are three types of foods and drink to look out for. One is pure stat food, either bi-stat or tri-stat, meaning it's giving you two stats, for example, stamina and health, or it's giving you all three stats, so health, stamina, magicka. Then there are drinks, which focus entirely on recoveries, and then there are in-between different food and drink options, which give you both raw stats and recovery combined. Now, for most beginner builds, I recommend one of those in-between options. For magicka builds, Witchmother's Potent Brew, and for stamina builds, Dubious Cameron Throne. Now, these give you health, which is extremely important for surviving, especially when you're learning the game, plus your offensive stat, either magicka or stamina, and a bonus recovery stat, either magicka or stamina recovery. This is literally the perfect option, and it can usually be bought for fairly cheap from guild traders. The only downside to this food really is that the stat part of it, the attribute part, is a bit lower. So once you improve as a player, you can then switch over to this bi-stat or tri-stat food, which will give you better overall stats, higher resources, which remember in ESO is actually equal to more damage and more healing, but obviously at the sacrifice of some recovery compared to these other options. And finally, I see potions as part of this whole discussion as well. Potions obviously give you resources back, but you want to make sure that you're getting the right resource, right? So if you know your build's focus is on stamina skills, you want basic stamina potions right away, and vice versa for magicka. Eventually, you can upgrade these to weapon power or spell power potions, which do come with some very useful buffs as well. These do things like increase your total weapon and spell damage, or increase your critical chance, though you can also get these same buffs for free using skills, so it's sort of a matter of convenience versus cost. But no matter what, make sure you have at least the basic potion that lines up with your main resource. That way, if your resource does get low, pop a potion and you can get a big chunk of that back right away. Step number 4 is picking the right Mundus Stone. Now, don't skip this step or ignore it, because without a Mundus Stone, you're missing out on a ton of free power for your build with lots of customization. If you're not sure what a Mundus Stone is, these are large statues found through the entire base game of ESO, 3 per zone, that provide bonuses to your basic stats. Things like more health, magicka, stamina, more spell damage, more weapon damage, and so on. And for a more detailed description of every Mundus Stone and what build it's good for, you can check out our Zero to Hero Build Academy, which goes into much greater depth and explanation on all the concepts here in this video. I'll have a link for that if you're interested down in the description below. But for a basic overview, if you plan on playing solo or DPS, then the Thief Mundus is going to be one of the best choices for you. This increases your critical chance, which is going to result in the most damage output for the majority of builds, especially as you approach level 50 and beyond. Another great option that is similar is going to be the Lover Mundus Stone, which increases your offensive penetration. This is especially good for solo and for PvP builds, where you want to bypass as much of your enemy's armor as possible. Now, tanks will typically use the Lord Mundus Stone for even more health, or the Atronach Mundus for more magicka recovery, and healers even have a dedicated Mundus Stone for better healing, called the Ritual. Again, you'll want to look at all of the options available here and go back to your build goal to make sure that whatever Mundus Stone you choose, it's supporting that goal as much as possible. And above all, just make sure to have a Mundus early, because this is something many new players skip, and it's very easy to overlook. Next up, let's talk about choosing the best skills for your build, which is where many players start to get overwhelmed because there are just so many options. First, every class in ESO gets access to 3 distinct class skill lines. Usually these are very thematic and focus on the various tools and playstyles that make your class unique. These are some of the strongest skills in the game, so you'll want to start using these right away. In fact, it's best to start the game by placing 1 skill from each of your 3 class skill lines onto your active skill bar so that you can start leveling each class skill line equally. Keep those 3 skills on your skill bar at all times until they level up all the way to rank 4 and can be morphed. And then you can choose to morph them and continue leveling them up, or take the next skill in the skill line and level that up instead. Your goal here is basically to reach skill rank 50 for your class skill lines, which will unlock all of your class skills as well as your very important class passives, which we'll talk about in a minute. And in addition to maxing out your class skills, you'll also need some weapon and armor skills. And this is completely dependent on your build composition, but usually goes as follows. For magicka damage dealers, you'll want to level up Destruction Staff. This is typically used as both a front bar or primary weapon and a backup or back bar weapon. For stamina damage dealers, you'll want to level up Dual Wield or Two-Handed for your main front bar weapon, as well as Bow for your secondary backup weapon. For healers, you'll want to start leveling up that Restoration Staff skill line as your primary, and then the Destruction Staff skill line as your secondary weapon. And for tank builds, you'll want to start leveling up your Sword and Shield skill line as your primary weapon, as well as the Destruction Staff as a secondary or utility weapon. Now, yes, there are some variations possible to these formulas, especially for solo builds and PvP, which are a bit more open-ended, but generally speaking, the combinations I've mentioned here tend to work best and will give you a good starting point. Next up, let's talk about skill selection and getting the right mix of skills onto your skill bars. For damage dealers and solo builds, you'll want a good mix here of direct damage skills, along with some AoE damage and damage over time effects. And once you unlock 2 skill bars, you'll be able to organize your skills so that your direct damage, both single target and AoE, can be placed on your primary skill bar, and your damage over time skills and self buffs can be placed on the back bar. The main reason to set up your skill bars like this is because your dots and buffs just last longer, letting you cast them and forget them for usually 15 to 20 seconds at a time. This will let you swap back to your front bar and focus on those damage skills, which are the primary purpose of your build and what you want to spend the most time using. Also, you want to make sure to have some defense and healing skills somewhere on your bar for emergencies, Typically, this would be a direct heal or a shield, and these emergency skills can be placed on the front or the back bar, whichever you prefer. For pure healing builds, you'll of course want a good mix of healing skills on both skill bars, including powerful direct healing skills, healing over time, AoE group heals, and buffs. These will come from both the Restoration staff skill line and your own class skills, as most classes have at least one skill line focused on healing and buffing yourself and others. For example, the Templar class has a powerful direct healing skill, Breath of Life, from their Restoring Light skill line, which could then be combined with Restoration staff skills like Combat Prayer or Radiating Regeneration. And as we mentioned earlier, healers generally run a back bar Destruction staff with skills like Wall of Elements and Elemental Drain for utility and sustain options. Finally, for tanks, you want a solid mixture of pure defense and healing skills to keep yourself alive, as well as group utility to help your group increase their damage, and of course multiple taunt skills to keep enemies on you rather than your friends. So Sword and Shield on your front bar is a great way to do this with skills like Pierce Armor, which is a great taunt and an armor debuff, and also skills like Heroic Slash, which is a damage debuff and ultimate generation tool for yourself. And generally you'll mix in some healing and group utility here from your class skill lines. And backbar options are a bit more open for tanks, though Destruction Staff is typical. You can still build a solid tank with another Sword and Shield backbar, or even a two-handed backbar. So like I said, plenty of options here. Let's dive into an example just to show you a little bit in more detail what I'm talking about. Here I am on a Magicka Templar, sort of a DPS / solo build. So I've got a mixture of damage skills, utility skills, defense, and healing basically. On my front bar, which is our main offensive setup, we've got Puncturing Sweep. This is our main damaging DPS skill. We've got Toppling Charge, which is a damaging skill. Also a Gap Closer with some utility, sets enemies off balance. Got another damage skill, but this one is a damage over time, Blazing Spear. Normally I put most of my dots on the back bar, but the exception here is this one is fairly short at only 10 seconds. So I'll be able to cast this at the beginning of a rotation, and then when I come back, it should be ready to recast again. Living Dark is a heal with a bit of utility, so I'm going to save this for when I start taking damage. And then I've got just a passive skill here, really. Inner Light gives me some good max magicka. And of course, our ultimate here is going to be Flawless Dawnbreaker. You can see mostly offensive skills here with a bit of utility and healing thrown in. Let's go ahead and swap to the back bar to show you how I set this up differently. Back bar typically is damage over time effects, buffs, and dots. As I said, these are the longer lasting skills. You can sort of cast these, set them and forget them, and go to your back bar less often so you can focus on those front bar damaging skills. So we've got Blockade from the Destruction Staff skill line. We've got Solar Barrage as well as Ritual of Retribution, some AoE damage over time skills. I do have one Emergency Burst Heal, Breath of Life. It's going to be great for group content as well in case I need to save somebody. And our main buff here, Channeled Focus, which gives us Major Resolve as well as some good Magicka recovery and healing. And our back bar ultimate here, Fiery Rage. This I put on the back bar because our front bar, generally you want an ultimate that also has some passive bonuses. Flawless Dawnbreaker will give me some bonus weapon and spell damage, as well as ultimate generation. So it really makes sense to have this on the front bar where I can benefit from those passives. So there you go. That is how I would put together a build, prioritizing different skills on my front bar versus back bar, depending on what I need them to do. We're going to jump into passives next, but if you guys do find this type of content helpful, let me know by hitting that like button down below. It actually lets YouTube know that this is great content that it will then share with other players, so it's really appreciated. Keep in mind also that this video is really just an overview of the entire build process in ESO. I have a much more in-depth version of this over on my website called the Zero to Hero Build Guide for the Elder Scrolls Online. That version is actually over 2 hours long, broken out into several videos and guides with full examples. So definitely check that out if you want to get more in-depth on the entire process from start to finish. Now, if you get anything at all from this video, you need to understand this. Passives in ESO are actually one of the strongest and most important aspects of your build. The more passives you unlock, the stronger you get, especially if you are under level 50. In fact, before you get to level 50, you'll want to invest just as many skill points, if not more, into your passive skills than you do with your active skills. Passives in ESO just grant your build so much more damage, better healing, cost reduction, bonus resource recovery, and a lot more. Now, obviously, the focus of your build will determine the passives you unlock first. For solo builds and damage dealers, you'll want to focus on increased damage. Healers have powerful passives as part of their class skill lines, which can increase their healing and sustain, which you'll want to get right away. And as a tank in ESO, you want to focus on any passives that increase your armor, damage reduction, and block mitigation. Now, in addition to class passives, you'll also want to explore both your weapon and armor passives as soon as possible. These are going to add even more power to your build, depending on the type of weapon or armor that you're using. For weapons, you'll generally want to focus first on some cost reduction and damage passives. For example, all weapon types should have some form of passive cost reduction that lowers the cost of your abilities from that weapon skill. The two-handed skill line, for example, has the Balanced Blade passive, which reduces the stamina cost of all two-handed abilities by 15%. Cost reduction is important, means you'll be able to cast more weapon skills for less resources. Now for armor skills, both damage dealers and healers will generally use a mix of light armor and medium armor passives. Obviously, this depends on the sets that you're wearing. There's no point in investing into medium armor passives if all you're wearing is 7 pieces of light armor and vice versa. But both light armor and medium armor have great passive options, and it's worth wearing some pieces of both armor types to get a wider spread of bonuses. Now for Magicka users, your primary armor should be light. And this is specifically for the light armor passive called Evocation, which reduces the cost of your Magicka abilities and provides bonus Magicka recovery. Again, this is all about sustain, letting you cast more skills before you run out of resources. For stamina users, your primary armor type should be medium. This is again due to a specific passive, which reduces the cost of your stamina skills and gives you bonus stam recovery. This is called Windwalker. Now tanks will generally invest into heavy armor, which comes with some great defensive passives as well, including bonus armor, bonus health and health recovery, as well as healing taken, and more. So if you're on a tank, you'll want to max out those heavy armor passives quickly as well. And again, if you remember anything at all from this video, it's that passives are one of the main keys to improving your build's power, so make sure to understand which passives are best for your build and unlock those as soon as possible. There are literally hundreds of item sets in the Elder Scrolls Online, which can make it very confusing to get your build off to a good start. Now, my technique that I prefer to make things simple and easy for my builds is to go back to that first step and focus in on the goal of the build and what I want to achieve. Your goal will determine what sets will be best for you and really help to narrow down your options. For example, if your goal is to do as much damage as possible, then equipping a set that boosts your max health, something like Plague Doctor, for example, is just a complete waste of a set because, as we talked about with attributes, health is a defensive stat, and for most builds in ESO, it's not going to do anything to improve your damage. And beyond that, it'll be very helpful to understand basic set bonuses as well. We already know about stamina, magicka, and health, and what builds those are best for, but there are many other set bonuses in ESO that you need to consider as well. Now, to improve your damage, the best set bonuses you'll want are critical chance and offensive penetration. These options tend to scale the best, especially at level 50 and beyond. So if your goal is to increase your damage, make sure to prioritize sets with these specific set bonuses. In addition, we already covered weapon and spell damage bonuses and magicka and stamina bonuses, which are also offensive stats that improve your damage, though these options are slightly less powerful than critical chance and penetration. Keep in mind that you'll typically find these set bonuses on either light or medium armor sets, which you'll need to consider as well. Now, if you want to be a tank build or just improve your defense, you want sets that include health bonuses, as we mentioned before. Other set bonuses you can include here include bonuses to armor, which improves your overall resistances and helps you take less damage from attacks, as well as the healing received bonus, which means you'll be healed for more anytime you receive a heal. These set bonuses usually appear on heavy armor sets, which are generally the best for tanking because of those heavy armor passives, which we already mentioned. And finally, if healing is your focus, you'll want to prioritize sets with stats like max magicka or max stamina. and weapon and spell damage, but also things like bonus recovery, especially magica recovery, as most healing skills tend to cost magica to cast. Boosting your recovery will greatly help with your overall sustain, helping you cast more abilities without having to worry about running out of resources. Again, there are way too many sets in ESO to start reviewing individual sets for the purpose of this video, but once you start to recognize those specific set bonuses as being good for your build, you can start to narrow down the options and plan what you want to farm next. Also, don't forget that you can adjust your stats as you go by changing out any of the bonuses from the previous steps that we've talked about, including your attribute points, your food or drink, your Mundus Stone, and so on. So, for example, you might find that if you focused on purely damage bonuses for your sets, then your actual build's recovery and sustain might dip a little bit lower than you're comfortable with. But you can always go back and improve that by swapping to a different food with perhaps a higher recovery, or even using recovery glyphs, which we'll talk about in a minute. Once you have your sets chosen and you begin farming them, the next step is to decide on your traits and glyphs. These options allow for even more customization for your build, allowing you to focus in on specific strengths. Both traits and glyphs apply to every piece of gear you can collect, including armor pieces, weapons, and jewelry. So let's go over some of the best options you should be looking for. First, let's talk traits, and specifically weapon traits, as these tend to have the biggest overall impact on your build's performance. For a damage-focused build, such as a DPS or solo build, the best option for your weapons trait is usually Precise, which greatly increases your critical chance. Usually you want Precise for your main weapon, or as it's called, your front bar weapon, and this is because that extra critical chance that you get for slotting that weapon will turn more of your attacks and even heals into critical strikes, meaning they'll do more damage or even heal for more health. Now, this gets even more important as you approach endgame and begin to increase your critical damage multiplier, leading to potentially huge damage spikes when you score those critical attacks. Now, second popular option, especially for solo gameplay and even some PvP builds, is the Sharpen trait. This increases your penetration against enemies, letting your attacks do more true damage after ignoring their resistances. And finally, you will definitely want an infused backup or backbar weapon, as it's called, for most solo and DPS builds, which increases the power of your weapon's glyph, also known as its enchant. Now, this is due to mostly one backbar enchant in particular, the weapon and spell damage glyph, also sometimes called a berserker enchant, as this is simply the most efficient way to buff your damage higher once you approach endgame. Now, for builds that want improved defense and utility, there aren't quite as many options for weapon traits. Popular choice is definitely going to be the defending trait. This increases your armor while using that weapon, so it's a decent option for tanks or even solo players and PvPers that want some added protection. Decisive is another popular weapon trait among tank builds because it allows you to gain ultimate much quicker, which can then be used to empower or defend your entire group. And Infuse can also be used for utility, as well as you can equip a Crusher enchant here on your infused backbar weapon and apply a powerful resistance debuff to enemies. Now, for better healing, there really is just one main choice, which is the Powered trait. This directly boosts your healing, so it's a great option for a main weapon restoration staff, for example, on a healer build, but this can also be used on any build in ESO that wants better healing. Moving on to armor traits, which affect our body armor pieces as well as shields. Now, the majority of builds will want to use one very powerful trait, and that is the Divines trait. Divines will increase the potential value of your chosen Mundus Stone by a substantial amount, especially with 7 full pieces. Now, we already discussed how powerful those Mundus Stones are in ESO, so it should make sense that improving them by an additional 50% or more is going to be a great approach for most builds. This is especially true for DPS builds, solo builds, and healers. For tank builds and PvP builds, however, there are more options you'll want to consider that have a better defensive focus. These include the Sturdy trait for tanks, which reduces the cost of blocking, and the Impenetrable trait for PvP, which reduces your damage taken from critical hits. Also, Well-Fitted is another great defensive trait here that reduces the cost of roll dodge and sprinting. And finally, when selecting the best jewelry traits for your build, you can settle for the basic traits that come with all jewelry pieces by default. That's Arcane for more magicka, Robust for more stamina, and Healthy for, you guessed it, more health. But there are a few slightly better traits you can use, either through crafting or transmutation. For example, damage-focused builds and solo builds can use the Bloodthirsty trait to dish out even more damage when enemies get low health. And for tanks and healers, the Infuse trait is a fantastic option here, which will buff the power of your jewelry enchantment. This is usually going to be paired with either recovery or a cost reduction glyph to provide the most utility for your build. Our next topic is Glyphs, which are yet another build customization option in ESO that can add even more power to your setup if used correctly. Glyphs are basically additional bonuses that can be applied to weapons, armor, and jewelry that provide even more important stat buffs. Let's start off with armor glyphs first, as these are the simplest to understand. The 4 basic options to enchant your armor are health, magicka, stamina, and prismatic defense. These give bonus resources to whatever name is within the glyph, with the exception of prismatic glyphs, which give all 3 resources just at lower amounts. Here you can see the effect of all 4 glyphs at legendary quality. And as we already discussed, you most always want to stack into one resource pool, especially for simple builds like solo, DPS, or healers. If you're building a Stamina Nightblade, for example, you'd want all of your armor glyphs to be stamina. The exception to this rule would be tank builds and potentially PvP setups, where you'd want more health glyphs for survival. Another important thing to know about armor glyphs is that certain armor pieces give higher glyph values than others. These are the chest, legs, and the head. These armor pieces give quite a bit more resources compared to other pieces, including the belt, gloves, shoulders, and feet. Jewelry glyphs can be enchanted to your necklace and rings, and the typical enchants here are weapon and spell damage, or magicka or stamina recovery. As you'd expect, the goal of your build will dictate the best glyphs for you here. For DPS and solo builds, using weapon and spell damage enchants on all jewelry pieces is recommended to maximize your damage. Now, in update 37, these glyphs will actually be updated to include both weapon and spell damage combined, with a small recovery bonus thrown in as well, meaning you won't need to worry about picking one or the other. The stats will be combined, so it'll be much simpler. And as far as tank builds for jewelry, you'll typically want to go full magicka recovery glyphs here to help sustain those important magicka costing buffs and debuffs, since tanks are usually not as concerned about their damage. Then healers may want a mix of damage and recovery because, remember, higher damage in ESO also translates to higher healing values, and recovery is always important no matter what. Lastly, in terms of weapon glyphs in ESO, you have a few powerful options here as well. We also need to mention that front bar and back bar glyphs usually serve a completely different purpose. Front bar glyphs tend to be more offensive, while back bar glyphs tend to focus more on buffing and debuffing. Some popular options for front bar weapon glyphs include flame, shock, frost, poison, and disease enchants. All of these cause damage of that type and can also cause some powerful status effects, such as burning from flame enchants. Now, my usual pick for front bar, however, is usually either absorb magicka or absorb stamina. These basic glyphs also do damage, just like the elemental glyphs we mentioned, but they also restore resources at the same time, which is a fantastic option for extra sustain. So if your build uses mostly stamina skills, you'd want to use the absorb stamina enchant, but if your build uses mostly magicka skills, you'd want to use the absorb magic enchant. And finally, let's talk about the very important back bar glyph, which tends to focus on either buffs or debuffs. For DPS and solo builds, and even PvP and healer builds in some cases, the best glyph to run on your back bar is the combined weapon and spell damage enchant, sometimes called a berserker glyph. The simple glyph gives you a huge increase to your overall damage, which means all of your abilities will be stronger, including your heals. Remember, however, that since this is a weapon glyph, it works best when using a weapon skill on that same bar. AoE weapon dots tend to work best to proc this enchant. For example, Elemental Blockade from the Destruction Staff skill line, or Endless Hail from the Bow skill line. And finally, tanks and some healing builds can use this back bar glyph for more utility to debuff enemies. The best option for this is the Crusher enchant, which debuffs enemy armor. Champion points is definitely something that seems intimidating at first, but once you figure out the patterns and the way it works, it's fairly easy to add these options into your build and make it even more powerful. So the first thing that you need to know is the 3 champion point clusters. We have green, which is called Craft, blue, which is called Warfare, and red, which is called fitness. Generally speaking, the green champion points are more utility related. Warfare is more direct combat, things that affect your damage, your healing, your tankiness. And fitness is more combat actions, things like sprinting, roll dodging, and a little bit of survivability and recovery thrown in. Now for the green tree, since this does not directly affect combat or really your build very much, I'm going to skip over this for now. This is highly customizable, so just look into the tree and see where you want to spend your points. Now, blue tree, we said it has a lot. Okay, this is probably the most complicated star because there's really something here for everybody, but they're all contained in specific areas, which I think makes it easier. So let's start first with damage. Now, damage tends to be these over here on the right. Okay, you have things like increased single target damage, increased AoE damage, increased dot damage. So you have some damage potential over here. Now, on the opposite side, as you might guess, you have more healing options. So this is kind of the healing side, increasing your healing done by AoE effects, healing over time effects, single target heals. So as you can see, it's already pretty simple. If you're a damage dealer, you're going to be unlocking these slotted stars. If you're a healer build, you're going to be focused on these slotted stars. Now, there's actually room for tanks down here in this section. Here's where we have our defensive slotted stars. So for example, Unassailable reduces your damage taken from AoEs. Duelist Rebuff reduces your single target damage. Enduring Resolve reduces your damage over time. Now remember, you can only have 4 slotted CP stars, so you will definitely focus on your role. If you are a damage dealer, you'll be focusing here. If you're a healer, you'll be focusing here, and so on. And the last thing I will say in this tree is don't miss the sub-constellations. A lot of people actually miss this, where if you see the purple here, you can click into this and get even more options. Some pretty cool options, actually. For example, Weapons Expert. I love this star if I'm doing a light attack or heavy attack, especially focused build. Something like a Magicka Sorcerer with a lightning staff, or a werewolf build, something like that. This increases the damage of your light and heavy attack specifically. Other than that, you do have some passive stars here. Piercing increases your offensive penetration. And then you'll typically go either to the right side if you are a stamina build, and then to the left side if you're more of a Magicka focus build. Mastered Curation gives you even more options for healers. And then down here, Staving Death gives you more defensive options, but this is great for everybody. Every build should unlock Staving Death and specifically pick up Preparation. This is a 10% flat damage reduction for all damage taken outside of PvP, so just PvE content basically. You would definitely want to unlock this one. Finally, in the red tree, like we said, this is more of our survivability, resources, sustain, sprinting, dodge, rolling, blocking, that kind of stuff. Over here on the left, you have some good options for basically padding out your stats. You can get extra health, extra armor, extra recovery. I do recommend these for a lot of builds, things like solo builds. Over here, towards the middle, you have 2 very important passives for sustain. So this is going to be for you DPS players out there, or solo builds. You'll want to unlock Bloody Renewal if you're stamina focused. This gives you 1500 stamina back when you kill an enemy, which is huge. And then the same thing here, Siphoning Spells is the Magicka version. Very important passives for sustain. It makes sustain super easy. The more enemies you kill, the more resources you get back. A couple other favorites I will mention here. Bastion. One of my favorites for a solo build. I tend to use damage shields a lot, whether it's, Brawler with a 2-hander, or I'm using a light armor damage shield, Sorcerer Hardened Ward damage shield, something like that. Even damage shield sets and Glyphs can benefit from this, up to 15% bonus size to your damage shield. This is really powerful for solo builds. Definitely check that out. Over here on the right, you have some of your more tank-focused passives. Things like reduced cost of blocking, increasing the amount of damage you can block, so definitely check out the right side if you are focused on a tank build. And the red tree has some sub-constellations also. Wind Chaser is all about extra movement speed. There's actually a slotted star here that gives you 10% bonus speed at all times. It's pretty good. And over here, Survivor's Spite. Some of these can be good options for PvP. For example, Pain's Refuge reduces your damage taken by 2%. For every 2 negative status effects on you, up to 20% damage reduction for this guy. This is going to be insane if you want to play in Cyrodiil. If you want to play very tanky, if you want to play a very tanky PvP build, check this out. Same thing here, sustained by suffering, and it's going to increase your recovery based on getting those negative effects on you. Here's another great one for PvP. Juggernaut is another slotted star, helping you take less damage overall. So those are just some ideas to get you started. Remember, the main thing is you can only have 4 slotted stars for each tree. Now let's move on to the final important part of creating the perfect build in ESO. Before we end this video, there's one more thing that you need to make sure you're doing with your builds, and that is you need to be testing them out. There are a variety of ways to do this, and these are some of my favorite options. Let's start off with DPS builds first, and this is pretty much the simplest thing you can test. You need a target dummy for this. Now, the most reliable option for target dummies used across the game, especially for DPS parses, is going to be the 21 million health raid dummy. Now, I understand that not everyone has access to this. You can only buy this in the Crown Store, and it is expensive. But if you're getting to this level where you want to get into harder content, specifically trials and veteran trials, what you can do is actually find a guild that does those type of events, and they should have a guild house available that has that raid dummy in it so you can test out your build. This is going to be the most accurate DPS test because it simulates group situations where you have the most important and powerful buffs. Now, if you're not to that point yet, if you're just getting started with DPS builds, then any type of target dummy is fine for practice. You can get a cheaper option, and some of these are even craftable. So feel free to look for other options, but make sure that you're doing some parsing no matter what. You want to be checking your DPS numbers, which do come out on consoles as well, or use add-ons if you're on PC. Now, solo builds, in my opinion, are all about survival, so some of my favorite ways to test out a new solo build is just to go up to a world boss and see if I can solo it. I want to see if I can take the damage either with a shield or some other defensive strategies, and I want to see if I can heal through the boss's attacks, and I want to see if my damage is good enough to kill the boss quickly. Now, not every world boss in ESO is the same. Some are easy, some are medium, and some are hard. One of the most challenging is actually Minotaur Stone Skin, which you can see right here. He's found in the zone of Rivenspire, and this is one of my favorite tests for a solo build. I know if I can solo this fight, that my build is pretty strong. Now, in testing out a tank build, this is actually very similar to how I would test out a solo build. First thing I would do after creating the build is walk up to a world boss and see how well I can take it. Can I do enough healing to keep up my health? For this process, I would definitely look for more difficult world bosses. Another thing you can do if you think your build is particularly strong is try to solo a dungeon, ideally in veteran mode because veteran dungeon enemies hit the hardest. You can just walk your way through the dungeon, try to grab all the enemies, and see if you can tank through them and make your way to the first boss if possible. Then try tanking that boss as well. If you can do all of this, then your build is very good in terms of survival. Now, healer builds are one of the hardest builds to test outside of group content for obvious reasons. But one thing you can do now, especially that we have the companion system, is use your companion as a tank and try to keep them alive as a healer. Same thing as before, we could go up to a world boss and see if we can heal through the damage and keep our companion alive. Companions, if they're not set up properly, are actually very squishy and can die fast. So if you do a good job of keeping your companion alive here, that's definitely a good test of your healer build and means it will be successful in group content. Similar to testing a tank, you can also bring yourself and your companion into a dungeon as well and see how long the two of you can last. This would be another great test of healing potential. And finally, we have PvP builds, and again, this is a little bit difficult to test outside of the actual PvP environment, but there are some things you can do in PvE to get started. One of my favorite things to do is just find some mobs that have more health than average. One of my favorites is actually the werewolves that you can find all over Glenumbra. These have about double the health of a normal enemy in ESO, so around 60k health. There are actually several here in this area just east of the Eaglebrook Way Shrine. And so really what I'm looking for is burst combo potential. How quickly can I kill this enemy? If I can kill a 60k health enemy in 1 to 2 seconds with a burst combo, then that's a pretty decent option that I can bring into PvP as well. Now, obviously, that's just for testing the offensive side of things. If you want a better, more complete test, then I would definitely recommend queuing into Battlegrounds to see how your build performs. Keep in mind, though, that Battlegrounds does not have champion points active, but I actually prefer to test my build without CP anyway, so I can see where the real deficits are in terms of sustain and defense and healing. But as I mentioned before, please do me a favor and crush that like button if you enjoyed this build guide overview for ESO. I spent a ton of time collecting this information and putting it all together, so I really hope this was helpful for you, and I'm sure it's going to improve your builds if you follow this guide step by step. Speaking of which, don't forget to check out our Zero to Hero complete build guide over on my website. This is basically an expanded version of what I went through here with over 2 hours of content going into every single detail of creating the perfect build for you from start to finish. I even created a build planner here that gives you a place to record and plan all of your build details. I'll have a link for that again down below if you're interested in checking it out. And thanks again for watching.